Friends, this morning we are continuing our sermon series called Roots, Our Methodist Heritage. In this series, we have been following in the footsteps of John Wesley as he grew up and ultimately founded what we know today as the United Methodist Church. And so if you've missed any of the sermons in this series and you would like to pick them up, you can find them on our Facebook page, as well as you can go to our YouTube channel from our website as well. So feel free to do that. So this morning I am reading from the letter of James, chapter 2, verses 14 through 18, and I am reading in the Common English Bible. My brothers and sisters, what good is it if people say they have faith but do nothing to show it? Claiming to have faith can't save anyone, can it? Imagine a brother or sister who is naked and never had enough food to eat. What if one of you said, "Go in peace, stay warm, have a nice meal"? What good is it if you don't actually give them what their body needs? In the same way, faith is dead when it doesn't result in faithful activity. Someone might claim, "You have faith and I have action." But how can I see your faith apart from your actions? Instead, I'll show you my faith by putting it into practice in faithful action. May God add blessing to the reading, hearing, and understanding of these words. Over the last couple of weeks, our country has experienced yet another set of incidents involving gun violence in places where we ought to feel safe. On Saturday, October 27th, a gunman burst into the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, while Shabbat morning services were in progress. By the time the shooter was apprehended, 11 people were dead and others were wounded in what has been called the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in our country's history. And just 4 days ago, on the night of November 7th, a 28-year-old former Marine wearing black clothing and carrying a semi-automatic pistol fitted with a high-capacity magazine that had been banned by the federal government approached the Borderline Bar and Grill in Thousand Oaks, California. Before entering the country western bar frequented by college students in the area, he shot and killed the security guard who was standing outside the door. Then the gunman went inside and shot more guards and employees of the bar before moving on to shoot patrons who were inside the bar, throwing smoke bombs along the way in order to camouflage his presence. In that senseless act of violence, 12 people died, including a police officer, before the shooter finally took his life. Of the 12 who lost their lives, 8 were college students in their early 20s and late teens. And one was a 27-year-old man who had survived the Las Vegas shooting just a little over a year ago. According to data from the Gun Violence Archive, this year our country has experienced more than 300 mass shootings, and that is defined as an incident where 4 or more people have died. The Thousand Oaks shooting was number 307. These incidents and the many that have gone before are not only tragic and heartbreaking and maddening, but they are also a sure sign that we are living in a broken world. Consider the following newspaper clipping. Gambling, robbery, sexual immorality, and violence is prevalent today. Half of all children are born out of wedlock. Purity and fidelity to the marriage vows have been sneered out of fashion. Corruption in politics is rampant. The world is broken. Sound familiar? Well, would you believe that that newspaper article was printed in 1694? Yeah, it was. Which means that even in the 17th century, they felt they were living in a broken world. And they were right. And it was into this broken world that John Wesley, the 15th son of Samuel and Susanna Wesley, was born. And it was this broken world, in this broken world, that he felt compelled to fix in grateful response to God's grace in his life. As we discussed last Sunday, Wesley believed that God's grace manifests itself in three very important ways. First, through prevenient grace, which we are given before we know we even need it. Next, through justifying grace, which we receive when we acknowledge and accept God's activity in our lives. And then third, sanctifying grace, during which we grow and mature in our ability to live just as Jesus lived. For John Wesley, God's grace was a journey, not a destination. And when we, as God's people, accept God's gift of grace, we are inspired then to do good works because we are grateful for what we have been given. What's more, when we accept God's grace, we begin to pay attention to God. We pay attention to God's whispers or nudges, those feelings that we get when God wants us to do something. When we have accepted God's grace, we become more aware of God's will for our lives. And we become open to hearing God's voice. We also realize that we no longer do good deeds in order to win God's favor. Instead, we understand that God's favor is already ours. It's a gift. And because of that, we do good works in grateful response for God's grace. This was not only what John Wesley taught, this was also how John Wesley lived. It was the way that he ordered his own life and the lives of the early Methodists who were part of the movement. Remember, Methodism in Wesley's day was not a religion. It was not a denomination. It was a movement through which John Wesley led a revival, through which he encouraged Christians to be 100% dedicated to our faith, to be what he called altogether Christians. The early Methodists were expected to worship in their Anglican parish churches, and it was there that they were to receive the sacraments, not in the Methodist meeting houses. They were expected as Anglicans to participate in works of piety, acts of devotion and worship, like constant prayer, frequent worship, and receiving the sacraments as often as they could. But it was through the Methodist movement that they were also encouraged to participate in works of mercy, because they were just as important as works of piety. Wesley understood from his college days with the Holy Club, when they visited prisoners and helped the poor who were living on the streets of Oxford. He understood, as did his brother Charles and the other Methodists in Oxford and beyond, that they were meant to do good deeds in the world. But their motivation for doing those good deeds had changed. No longer were they doing good deeds in order to win God's favor. No, instead, they were motivated because they had received God's grace in order to do good deeds. And the rest, as they say, is history. For the rest of John Wesley's life, he inspired the Methodists to devote themselves to works of piety and works of mercy, devotion, compassion, and justice. After his outdoor preaching experience and the construction of the new room in Bristol, John continued traveling throughout Britain, preaching the good news of God's abundant grace. And in London, he decided to buy an old foundry, a place where weapons of war had been made, and he converted it into a place of worship where people could hear the Methodist preachers. But it also became more than just a place of worship. It was also a place where children, poor children, could receive an education, and where the sick who could not afford medical care were able to receive the care they needed without having to pay. The Foundry became the London headquarters for the Methodist movement, and for nearly 40 years it was a place where people could experience the presence of God. Unfortunately, the Foundry no longer exists. It's gone now. All that's left of it are a few pews and a pulpit and a plaque on a wall not far from the place where the Foundry once stood. But the legacy of the Foundry continues even today. Since the early days of the Methodist movement, numerous schools and hospitals have been founded by Methodists. In fact, right here in Arizona, in the heart of Phoenix, what is now known as Banner University Medical Center, or some of you might know it as Good Samaritan Hospital, it was originally founded by Miss Lulu Clifton, a Methodist deaconess who came to Phoenix and saw a need for a hospital in the area. Throughout our country, a number of schools, including colleges and universities, have been founded by Methodists and supported by the Methodist Church. All around the world, in foreign countries, including Africa, Methodists are present, educating and caring for the poor and the disadvantaged. And organizations like United Methodist Outreach Ministries and the United Methodist Committee on Relief and United Methodist Women, which has as one of its primary missions the work for justice through service and advocacy. These are just a few of the alphabet soup organizations that we have here in our denomination that respond in times of crisis and in need. Even local churches like ours have dedicated themselves and their resources to helping the poor and feeding the hungry. Why? Because works of mercy are part of who we are. It is part of our DNA as Methodists. It is our job to respond to the needs of the community and the world. Not just because John Wesley said so, but most importantly because Jesus said so. And Jesus lived it. I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was homeless and you gave me a room. I was shivering and you gave me clothes. I was sick and you stopped to visit. I was in prison and you came to me. Because whenever you did one of these things to someone overlooked or ignored, that was me. You did it to me. John Wesley and the early Methodists remind us who we are and who we are meant to be, not just as Methodists, but as followers of Christ. He reminds us that we are meant to do works of piety, acts of devotion and worship, as well as works of mercy, compassion, and acts of justice. And you know, although relatively speaking, we are a young church, having been only about 18 years old in existence, we too have taken these reminders very seriously. Through our apportionments, the part of our Sunday morning offering that goes to the conference and on to the general church, we support mission and ministry through the World Service Fund and other funds. We support local ministries by giving our time as well as our financial gifts to organizations like Jose's Closet, the Boys and Girls Club, Pan de Vida, Feed My Starving Children, and most recently House of Refuge, where we as a congregation collected $11,000 in order to sponsor a house, taking care of all the maintenance so that a family that would otherwise be homeless can have a place to call home. We have fed the hungry and given water to the thirsty. We have helped the homeless and comforted the sick. Some of us have even visited those who are in prison. And I think that says that we've done a lot as a congregation, right? In fact, some might say that we've done more than our fair share. But my friends, our task is not over. As followers of Christ, and especially as Methodists, we are called to continue to serve until all are fed and have clean water, until the homeless have shelter and the suffering no longer suffer. Our tasks as United Methodists will not be over until those things happen. We won't be done until all are treated fairly and justice at long last prevails. As Methodists, as Christians, we have a lot to do. And even though some of us may not feel we are physically able to actually do the work, we are all able to support the work that is being done through our prayers, our presence, and our financial gifts. Our love for Christ and our respect for John Wesley and all the Methodists who came before us guides us and strengthens us for the work that needs to be done. I pray that we as Methodists will not be people who only participate in works of piety, but that we will also be people who participate actively in doing works of justice and mercy and compassion.